On February 14th, right on Valentine's Day, a new film directed by Emerald Fennell was released, titled Wuthering Heights. Now, if you're not the kind of meticulous viewer or a film critic at heart like I am, you probably wouldn't spend your time listening to the direction explain that this new adaptation isn't really meant to retell the story of Catherine Heathcliff and the inhabitants of Wuthering Heights. Instead, it's presented more like a fan fiction interpretation, almost like a teenage girl reflection on Emily Bronte's original novel, which is actually a very serious and psychologically intense work. Today we're going to take a closer look at whether this latest project from a rather controversial director is actually worth our attention. We'll talk about how themes of love, passion, and psychological destruction are handled in the film, and even how Margot Robbie's costume shaped the way we perceive this adaptation. Just a quick reminder, my name is Alexandra and you are watching my author's channel. Today we're going to discuss whether Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights can truly be adapted into a full-length feature movie, or whether it might be better suited for something like an HBO miniseries, which could explore the story in greater depth while presenting a slightly modernized interpretation of the novel. And don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It's easy for you and it means a lot for me. In this video, I'm leaving out the whole storyline about the PR campaign run by Margot Robbie and her husband when they apparently decided that the best marketing strategy would be to start shipping the actors who play the main characters, Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. So let's discuss the first, that the novel is not a love story and that's the central contradiction between the novel and nearly all of its screen adaptations. So let's go back to the original source, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights itself. If you're not particularly interested in diving into the details of the novel or the earlier film adaptations, feel free to use the time-lapse and jump straight to this year's movie. But if you'd like to dig a little deeper into the story or hear my own retelling and analysis of how the original narrative unfolds, then let's take a moment to go through it together. First, a quick disclaimer. I actually reread the novel specifically for this review before I started criticizing Emerald Fennell's interpretation of the story. I didn't want to rely only on other people's opinion about the book or its adaptation. I always prefer to form and share my own view. So let's start further back in time. Imagine England in the second quarter of the 19th century, at the dawn of the Victorian era. A period defined by strict moral codes, particularly for women, and by their profound lack of rights and independence. Women, with very few exceptions, like the Brontë sisters, rarely received a proper education. Most were expected to marry whomever the family chose for them. And if a woman remained unmarried, again, as was the case with the remarkably talented Brontë sisters, she would typically spend her entire life with a narrow circle of family and close relatives. Women rarely traveled and rarely experienced anything new in their lives. Their sacred duty was to remain loyal to their family and their husband, have children, and take care of the household. And then, at the dawn of the Victorian era, in 1847, Emily Brontë publishes what would become one of the most controversial and innovative works of her time, Wuthering Heights. It was a shock, a complete break from the literary conventions of that era. At the very same time, the star of Charles Dickens was rising. The authors behind work like Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol, both of which have been adapted for the screen for many times. And then suddenly we get something completely different, a provocative, unsettling novel, a gothic novel. In fact, calling it a romance is a bit of stretch because the story contains almost none of what we usually associate with romance. There is no sentimentality, no comforting sincerity of feeling. Instead, the book reads almost like a psychological horror story of its time, a narrative where there are no truly positive characters and only the faintest hint of redemption, a small chance that the cycle of generational trauma might finally end. That fragile hope appears in the relationship between the younger generation, Hareton and Kathy, the children connected to Catherine and Hindley. Just to clarify, Hindley is Catherine's older brother, and the love story between Hareton and Kathy, who are technically cousins. It might sound strange to us today, but in that period of time it wasn't considered shocking or tabooed. Through the relationship between these two young characters, we see a small glimmer of hope. The idea that perhaps things could eventually become better. Whether Emily Brontë truly believed in that hopeful ending, or whether it was a deliberate narrative choice to prevent readers from condemning the novel for being entirely bleak and hopeless, that's something we may never know. But for me, and for many literary scholars as well, such a neat and hopeful ending feels somewhat unconvincing. But now let's talk about the different film adaptations, because almost every version runs into the same problem. Hollywood rarely shows us real main characters. We almost never see the true Heathcliff and Kathy, almost never see the true Heathcliff and Catherine as they exist in Emily Brontë's novel. Instead, most adaptations turn Heathcliff into the classic misunderstood bad boy with a hidden heart of gold. But in the original novel, Heathcliff is something completely different. He's not simply a rude, brooding, romantic hero, some kind of tortured lover with BDSM-style tendencies, as he's portrayed in the latest adaptation. And speaking of that, I can't resist showing you this short reel. In my opinion, it captures the new version of Wuthering Heights with Margot Robbie almost perfectly.
Я такая красивая. Я такая бедная.
Когда вырасту, хочу спиться и умереть.
А у кого это сегодня день рождения?
Да вон же! Время не вода.
Люблю его, я хочу за него замуж.
Я прошу прощения, за кого? Мне этот осел никогда не нравился. Ишак он и есть Ишак.
Выходи за меня, а?
Ты вычислила мои слабости.
Я не знаю, что они туда кладут, отрыфляет.
Быстро и без сожаления.
Со мной все нормально, просто я немножечко шалю.
Что здесь происходит?
A few moments later.
Внимание, Антоха взял микрозайм.
Можете сделать экстриптиз, можете сделать экстриптиз.
Как же было бы сейчас хорошо на БДСМ-вечеринке.
Я хочу, чтобы ты смотрел на мысли собачки.
Это грустно или весело? Это?
Now let's return to the character of Heathcliff. The boy's background is completely unclear. We don't know who is his parent, where, what he had gone through before they ended up in the Earnshaw household. But Emily Brontë makes one thing very clear. By the time Heathcliff arrives there, he is already a child who has seen far more of life than a typical boy his age. When Mr. Earnshaw, who in the latest film adaptation is portrayed almost like a tyrant, carries him back from Liverpool to Wuthering Heights, the boy fights back, kicks and resists him the whole way. Because of this struggle, the gifts Mr. Earnshaw had brought for his children are completely ruined by the time they arrive home. In the novel, Heathcliff is described as a rather handsome boy with a darker skin and thick black hair, almost like a little gypsy child who had been picked up off the streets. I don't want to dive too deeply into psychology here, but it's clear that the boy already carries a serious emotional trauma. At the very least, At the very least, he suffers from what we would now call attachment trauma. He has no parents, and throughout the entire novel, he never once mentions his real family or where he came from. He arrives at the Earnshaw household already old enough to understand what's happening, which means he knows perfectly well that he's not truly part of the family. He's something like a half-adopted outsider. They never fully adopt him. He's taught to read and write, but no one explains to Hindley, Catherine's older brother, that the boy shouldn't be bullied or mistreated. At the same time, Heathcliff is never sent away to live and work with the servants either. So he ends up in a stage in between position. On one hand, Mr. Earnshaw protects him and favors him, even over his own son. But the whole situation is handled awkwardly and without any real structure. And that only worsens the psychological damage to a boy who is already deeply vulnerable. There is also the issue of racial and social prejudices. No, Heathcliff is not described as a black boy from Africa, because if he had been, Mr. Earnshaw almost certainly would never have allowed him to be raised alongside her own children. But he is still described as a dark-skinned and visibly different from the typical English boy of that time. In my opinion, this detail was really reflected only in the 1992 film adaptation starring Ralph Fennell and Juliette Binoche. In that version, Fennell was given slightly darker skin to hint at Heathcliff's appearance in the novel. Personally, I thought the makeup looked a little unnatural, but his performance itself was excellent. Then, in the 2011 adaptation, Heathcliff was portrayed as a man of African descent. That's a much more radical interpretation of the character, and in many ways it reflects the period when filmmakers were increasingly casting actors of African heritage in roles where race historically wasn't part of the original story. A good example of that trend is the series Anne Boleyn, starring Judy Turner-Smith, which for many people became the peak example of that approach in historical filmmaking. But let's get back to the broader issue of film adaptations, because adapting Wuthering Heights is an incredibly difficult task. There are a few important reasons for that. First, if you present Emily Brontë's novel exactly as it is, with all its cruelty, trauma, and psychological complexity, it might only appeal to a relatively narrow audience, mainly viewed who enjoy dark psychological dramas. And even then, trying to fully develop both the main characters and the many secondary characters within a 2-hour movie runtime would be extremely difficult. Which is why I've always wondering why a studio like HBO hasn't attempted to adapt the novel as a limited series. That format would allow the story to unfold properly, giving space to the different plot lines instead of forcing the filmmakers to constantly choose between depth of storytelling and time constraints. Maybe after this year's adaptation, a company like HBO will finally consider taking on the story in that format. But there is another important point. Most filmmakers feel the need to make the main characters likable, to present them as romantic figures the audience can root for. And that's why Heathcliff is constantly softened in adaptations. He is turned into a broken man, wounded by love, a tragic romantic hero, almost a knight destroyed by heartbreak. But a knight does not take revenge on children. What many viewers forget is that in the novel, Heathcliff actually ruins the life of his beloved Catherine's daughter. He first forces young Cathy to marry his own son through manipulation and threats, and after that, he continues psychologically torment the girl. At the beginning of the novel, she appears beautiful but also hysterical, rough, and deeply unhappy. Let me repeat, this is a daughter of the woman he supposedly loved. So where exactly is the love here? What we see is obsession with an image, not love for a real person. Remember the famous scene after Catherine's death? Heathcliff begs her spirit not to find peace, not to leave this world. He doesn't say, rest peacefully and I'll take care of your daughter and your nephew. No, he asks her to remain, to haunt him, to become a ghost. And in the Christian tradition, that's essentially a curse, a soul that cannot find rest, a soul condemned to suffering. Trying to present someone like that as a hero of film is extremely difficult. Cinema usually demands sympathetic characters, people the audience can connect with or admire, but in Wuthering Heights there really aren't any characters like that. And that's where many screenwriters make their biggest mistake. They are so far to portray the characters exactly as Emily Brontë wrote them that they start rewriting the story. They add eternal love, soften the madness and psychological darkness that defines the novel. Catherine Earnshaw is also often turned into something like Juliet. And yes, the book even contains reference to Shakespeare, but Wuthering Heights is actually anti-Romeo and Juliet, and it's the inverted, destroyed version of that story. Catherine does not truly love Heathcliff. He keeps him emotionally tethered to her, treating him as someone who belongs to her, but she never genuinely cares about his feelings or emotional well-being. And that becomes especially clear as a novel as she grows older and begins manipulating him much more openly. It takes incredibly subtle and nuanced acting to portray the character of Catherine properly. After all, the main events of the novel unfold when Catherine is between 13 and 14 years old and her death at just 19, which means that realistically, you would need a very young and exceptionally talented actress capable of capturing the complex and contradictory nature of Catherine Earnshaw. And that's not even mentioning the supporting characters, who also need to reflect the spirit and tone of the novel, not simply serve as mannequins for beautiful dresses and period costumes. Third, another crucial factor is the atmosphere and visual style of the story. The novel is set in the late 18th century, and its entire emotional landscape is built around the contrast between two places. On one side, there is Wuthering Heights, and a state that almost functions as another character in the novel, a place that gradually destroys the souls of the people who live there. On the other side, there is another place which represents lights, order, and a sense of hope. Even the people who live there are described in brighter, softer tones. At the same time, the story is absolutely gothic, and that element can certainly be emphasized in a film adaptation, but it should remain more of a subtle undertone rather than dominating the entire visual language of the movie. Which means the director, the costume designer, and the production designer all need to have exceptional taste and restraint. And in a case like this, it's usually better to underplay the visual spectacle rather than overload the film with strange and distracting costumes like we saw in the latest adaptation. The 2026 adaptation and fan fiction built around the romanticization of an unequal relationship. So let's start a little further back with the official description of the film, because it actually reveals the central idea around which the entire story is built. The descriptions say that it's a story of passionate love between Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff, whom her father takes in and raises as his own. The plot follows the intense love between Heathcliff and Catherine, as well as Heathcliff's rage, pain, jealousy, and revenge, which he unleashes on the man who stands in the way of their marriage, Edgar Linton. And right here, we encounter a fundamental contradiction with the original source, the novel itself, and this movie. Forgive me for being a bit meticulous, but I tend to notice inconsistencies and contradictions. That's just how my brain works. Let me emphasize one very important point, a conceptual one. Wuthering Heights is not a love story. The book is often called a romance simply because no one has found a better gendered label for it. But the story is anything but a tale of passionate love between Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw. What we see instead is painful codependency, manipulation, revenge, and at times something close to psychological breakdown, but not romantic love. Edgar Linton did not prevent Heathcliff from marrying Catherine, not at all. Catherine herself chose to marry Edgar, not Heathcliff. And she did so with a very clear calculation. She married for status, security, and social freedom. She understood Heathcliff's nature perfectly well. She knew that their relationship could never lead to a stable life, a family, children. At this point, I'd like to share a few comments from people who have both read the novel and watched the film. The new Wuthering Heights feels more like erotic thriller, but around the love-pain dynamic. Heathcliff comes across more as a demonic lover, and his relationship with his wife is pushed to an extreme distortion. There is a big difference between consensual BDSM and domestic abuse. The director's choices make Heathcliff strangely acceptable, like a handsome guy with a dangerous wife. But in the novel, everything is much deeper, darker, and more tragic. In the new film, aesthetics and erotization overshadow everything else. Honestly, I wish they had given the film a different title. Something like Heathcliff or maybe Our Fates Intertwined. A title that references the original but also makes it clear that this isn't a literal adaptation. Because when you keep almost the same title and just put it in quotation marks, it doesn't really explain anything. And here's another opinion which I personally agree with. The film really has nothing in common with the book except for the names of main characters. That's it. That's where the similarities end. And when the PR campaign starts promoting it as inspired by one of the greatest romances of all time, that already tells me everything I need to know. Anyone who has actually read the book understands that it's not a romantic story. It's not about some grand love affair. It's a dark, harsh, psychologically complex text. And that's where things start to feel strange. I'm not someone who demands a frame-by-frame adaptation. I don't need a movie to follow the book word for word. An adaptation is always an interpretation. That's completely normal. But if you are using a classical literary work as a marketing tool, if you are selling the film through the cultural weight and reputation of that book, then maybe you should preserve at least something besides the characters' names. Otherwise, it feels like this. You take a recognizable brand, take the cultural prestige, take the reputation of the classic, and then sell a completely different story under that banner. And at that point, the issue isn't even about fidelity to the text, it's about honesty with the audience. Of course, there are also people who genuinely enjoy the film, but in most cases, those viewers tend to separate the movie from the novel entirely. And if you treat them as two completely different things, the original book and the film, then yes, the movie can be enjoyable, especially if you are in the mood for something closer to Romeo and Juliet style story, the kind of film where love is doomed by circumstances and the lovers can only be reunited in the afterlife. But honestly, I agree with the second comment. The film probably should have had a different title. The director's statement that this is a loose and free adaptation of the novel doesn't really remove the responsibility that comes with using the original title of Emily Bronte's work. I'm not against creative reinterpretations, modernized settings, or experimenting with the story. That's all perfectly fine, but in this case, it would be more honest to reflect that in the title of the film. Just look at the countless adaptations of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Sometimes filmmakers stick closely to the original story, and that's clearly reflected in the title. But other times, the story is openly reimagined in a modern setting, and again, that's communicated honestly from the start. or very simply play with the title itself. Capulets and Montagues, Romeo plus Juliet, or even Gnomeo and Juliet for that matter. The main character Heathcliff, while Jacob Elordi just doesn't fit. The worst part is that they basically whitened Heathcliff. In the novel, he is described almost like a dark-skinned gypsy boy, even compared to an Indian sailor. Casting that actor from Ethiopia for this role is honestly embarrassing. So let's talk about Jacob Elordi. My guess is that he was cast largely because he had already worked with the director before. They had an established working relationship, and visually he fits the image of a romantic hero in a period drama. A romantic hero. But Heathcliff is not a romantic hero. He is a deeply damaged person whose entire psyche is broken. He mistakes his obsession for love, and he interprets even kindness from Nellie as mockery or humiliation. One of the most important elements in the novel, the thing that becomes a real barrier preventing Heathcliff from entering high society, is his racial and social overness. His skin is darker than of the average Englishman, and he has black hair. That detail matters because it reflects the very real racism and prejudice present in England at the time, and frankly in much of the world as well. Heathcliff also has no name, no family history, and no clear origin. All of that becomes a source of constant insults and attacks against him. But in the film, he is simply portrayed as a handsome, dark-haired man with a brooding gaze. And realistically, a man like that, with enough money and respectable marriage, could probably find his way into respectable aristocratic society, maybe not the very highest circles, but certainly in the world where he would be accepted and respected. Which makes his interpretation a major simplification and a major distortion of the original story. And honestly, the film is full of simplifications like that. It almost feels as Emerald Fennell didn't understand 2/3 of the book, imagined her own version of what love in that period of English history might look like, and ended up giving us a very strange and rather superficial interpretation of the novel, as if none of us had actually read the original, and as if striking visuals could once again replace the story itself. But I don't want to dwell too long on the acting here. To me, very little of the real Heathcliff remains. The deep, complicated, broken character who doesn't love so much as destroy, and the key question, why does he destroy? This is a crucial point that Emerald Fennell completely missed. In her adaptations, she removes the extremely important character, Emily Earnshaw, Catherine's brother. That character is absolutely exceptional. In the novel, Mr. Earnshaw favors Heathcliff. He protects him and believes in him. But Hindley, Catherine's older brother, hates Heathcliff. He is one who bullies and humiliates him. After their father dies, Hindley pushes Heathcliff down to the level of a servant, forbids him from continuing his education, and constantly mistreats him. This conflict is vital to Heathcliff's development. It helps explain both his personality and his obsession with revenge. Heathcliff waits for years for the moment when his enemy will stumble, when Hindley will fall, and when he will finally have the upper hand. And his revenge lasts for years. He takes revenge not only on his enemies, but also on their children. Hindley's son and Catherine's daughter from her marriage. He even despises his own son, instead of trying to help him recover from illness. Heathcliff almost seems to wait for the boy to die. This kind of cold, unbearable, almost sadistic cruelty, which is central to Heathcliff's character, is completely absent from the film. In the movie, Heathcliff doesn't torment the next generation of the children at all, and that omission fundamentally changes the nature of the story. In the film, the characters of Catherine's father and her brother are essentially merged into a single character, her father. And that's another unforgivable simplification of the story, because it removes the entire arc of cold, calculated revenge that unfolds over the decades in the novel. In the movie, Heathcliff's story basically ends with Catherine's death. And even that scene feels rather underwhelming, because Heathcliff is portrayed as his tragic, broken, romantic hero. The film gives us a final montage of tender moments between them, their supposed love story. And that's it. The character's entire arc simply ends there. Sentimental, dramatic, and visually beautiful. It reminded me more of Romeo and Juliet, or even the story of Esmeralda and Quasimodo from Notre Dame de Paris of Victor Hugo. As if Heathcliff is destined to remain forever bounded to Catherine, and the next morning they might discover his body lying beside hers, the ultimate symbol of eternal love. Except that none of this really exists in the novel. Margot Robbie could have done 1,000 times better. A disappointingly superficial performance for such a complex project. One of the defining features of this adaptation, as I mentioned earlier in my analysis, is that Emerald Fennell places the narrative focus on Catherine Earnshaw, as played by Margot Robbie. By doing so, the film shifts the center of the story towards the female perspective and Catherine's internal struggle, the choice between love and money, passion and duty, freedom and comfort. In this version, Heathcliff mainly functions as a backdrop to Catherine's emotional journey, which steers the character of much of the depth he has in the novel. Catherine Earnshaw in this adaptation is portrayed as a strong-willed, confident beauty, somewhat romantic but also calculating, a young woman desperately trying to escape the oppressive control of her alcoholic father and the looming poverty she expects after his death. But I honestly don't remember Catherine in the novel being so preoccupied with money itself. Yes, she wanted to have money, but it wasn't because of her father. They had money. What attracts her to the Linton family and their estate? So, Linton's family is not the money as such, but the brightness and refinements of the world compared to the harsh atmosphere of Wuthering Heights. Their manners, their education, the elegance of their surroundings. And it's also worth remembering that in the novel, Edgar Linton is not just wealthy. He is also young, handsome, polite, and well-educated. Catherine does genuinely fall in love with him. Yet she also refuses to give up her feelings to Heathcliff. That emotional conflict is far more complicated than simply marrying for convenience or status. Over time, her feelings for Linton fade and Catherine comes to realize her mistake. In the film, however, all of this complexity is presented in a very simplified way. And of course, we also need to consider the age difference between Margot Robbie and the character she is portraying. In the novel, Catherine is not even 16 yet, and she dies at 19. The Catherine Earnshaw created by Emily Brontë is a deeply contradictional character. On one hand, she longs for independence, the freedom to be wild, selfish, and completely herself. On the other hand, she carries the ambition of someone born in a certain social position. She wants to claim her place in society and become a proper lady. She is capricious, impulsive, and something selfish, but also sincere, a heroine shaped by her time. When a woman was often forced to choose between passionate and socially accepted marriage, one of her most powerful monologues about love and impossibility of being happy even in heaven is absolutely heartbreaking. Catherine is torn between two men, and in her youthful selfishness, he refuses to choose between them. She doesn't want to sacrifice entire one. In the film, Margot Robbie delivers the original lines from the novel almost word by word, but somehow she doesn't add much emotional weight. Despite Robbie's natural charisma, her version of Catherine feels too grounded in everyday encounters. The central conflicts become rather practical choice. The man she cares about, but who is poor Heathcliff, versus the wealthy but unloved Edgar Linton. And essentially, the entire dramatic arc of the film revolves around that simplified dilemma. Which is more surprising is how surface-level Robbie's performance feels in the project's complex. If she had truly pushed the role further, many of the issues we are discussing now, the age gap, the simplifications of the script, might have faded into the background and reminded solely the responsibility of the director's interpretation instead. Robbie's performance actually flatters the character even more. Catherine begins to feel like a young woman obsessed with physical desire, which doesn't really align with the character as she exists in the novel. In Emily Bronte's book, sexuality is never explicitly foregrounded. The connection between Catherine and Heathcliff is far more symbolic and metaphorical. Their bond is deeper because it operates almost at an instinctive level. They understand each other's nature without needing physical expression. That kind of relationship doesn't require explicit fan fiction-style sex scenes or overly passionate bedroom moments. At times, the film's interpretation feels more like the imagination of a 15-year-old with an overactive romantic fantasy rather than a serious engagement with Bronte's gothic psychological drama. And the problem is that we and the director are long past that age, and most viewers aren't looking for another glossy but ultimately empty spectacle. Margot Robbie's dresses, a true explosion of imagination, and of course we can't talk about this film without mentioning Margot Robbie's costumes. The designers really went all out here. Every single dress seems more extravagant than the last. At times, it almost feels as if Emerald Fennell never quite got tired of playing with dolls as a child, and now she finally had the chance to go wild. One dress after another, each more elaborate than the previous one. The costumes were designed by Jacqueline Durand, a highly respected British costume designer who has worked on more than 30 films and received around 20 nominations for major awards. For Catherine Earnshaw, as portrayed by Margot Robbie, the team created around 50 different costumes. Let's start with the wedding dress. In the late 18th century, wedding gowns, like most women's dresses of the time, achieved their volumes through wide, structured skirts, but the rest of the design was usually fairly restrained. However, the dress worn by Margot Robbie's character doesn't really follow the conventions of the period. The design appears to be inspired instead of the style of Queen Victoria, who famously popularized the wide wedding dresses decades later, creating what became one of the long-lasting fashion traditions in history. For viewers familiar with Russian painting, Catherine's bridal look might even evoke the melancholy bride in Vasily Pukhariev's painting, The Unequal Marriage. The ivy branches decorated with sparkling stones that frame Catherine's head could symbolize both loyalty and devotion, but also the suffocating lack of freedom she faces, both in life and beyond it. Moving on, another outfit that drew a lot of attention was the cellophane dress. This is where the imagination truly runs wild. On her wedding night, Catherine Linton appears in a pale pink dress that looks almost like cellophane, like the wrapping used for bouquets of flowers. Paired with an ornate necklace, the costume makes her look like a beautifully packaged gift, a bride presented almost like an object wrapped in decorative paper. But honestly speaking, as someone who isn't partly a historian, this so-called cellophane dress feels like a direct insult to the historian period in which the story actually takes place. England has traditionally been associated with very puritanical and strict attitudes toward sexuality and private life. And considering Catherine's character, even with all her contradictions, it's hard to imagine that she would ever choose to wear something like that, even if such a material had existed and a talented dressmaker could have turned it into a perfect gown. In fact, wearing something so provocative could easily have led to serious consequences. her own husband might have labeled her immoral or inappropriable, and in that era it could even damage her reputation or social standing. You have to remember that during that period, women often didn't even undress completely, even in private, let alone wear something as revealing and theatrical as this on their wedding night. So yes, the designers really went all out here, perhaps a little too much. That said, the cellophane dress is actually more of an exception. For the most of the film, Margot Robbie character is dressed in white, black and red, with red in particular playing an important role in Catherine's visual identity. Red is Casey's key color throughout the film, and she also wears several pieces with reflective surfaces. The idea of shine and gloss is central to Catherine's character and her costumes. In one scene, for example, we used a scarlet skirt to visually echo the set design, the glossy rubberized floor of the library. The blouse, meanwhile, mirrors the soft white fabric-like walls of the room. Could Emily Brontë even have imagined that her heroine would one day appear in something resembling a black latex suit? What we are seeing here is exceptionally the silhouette of fairly typical Victorian dress combined with a modern synthetic material. And technically it isn't latex, but another experimental fabric. But the thing that made me laugh the most was the bright red Elton John style sunglasses. I honestly don't know how to call that. What was that supposed to be? Tell me in the comments what you thought about it. And to be completely honest, I find it hard to forgive Jacqueline Durran for what feels like a lack of respect for the historical settings, characters and the era of the story belongs to. The creators argue that they focused on emotion and character expression rather than strict historical accuracy. But perhaps it would have been better to spend more attention on the acting and the script rather than on such theatrical visual elements. To me, the aesthetic often feels too loud and too deliberate, as if the film is trying to say, it doesn't matter how the characters perform or how much the story has been altered, as long as the visuals look impressive. I'd also like to highlight another aspect of the film, passion and sex. Most of the story unfolds inside the dazzling, extravagant interiors of the Linton estate, set against the breathtaking landscapes of the Yorkshire moors. Visually, the film is undeniably impressive. In fact, the imagery, along with its chemistry between the two leads, is one of the few things that truly bring the movie to life. Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi do a convincing job portraying the physical attraction between their characters. Whatever else one might say, when they share the screen, they are definitely a spark. The problem is that their relationship never really moves beyond that spark. Fennell's version reduces the connection between Cathy and Heathcliff almost entirely to physical passion. In the novel, however, the sexual dimension of other relationship is largely implied rather than stated outright. Perhaps because Brontë saw it as almost insignificant compared to the overwhelming emotional and psychological torment between the characters. Fennell, on the other hand, makes physical desire the central focus of the film. Even the cruelty that characters inflict on one another, a theme that runs deeply through Bronte's novel, becomes sexualized in this adaptation. And at times it even starts to feel unintentionally comical. This could perhaps be described as a bold reinterpretation of a classic, but in the 21st century, scenes of masturbation, marital sex, or passionate encounters in a carriage aren't exactly shocking anymore. The 2026 version of Wuthering Heights can really be called a complete failure. It will certainly fight its audience and provoke emotional reaction. But like many cinematic spectacles, when you leave the theater after the intense chemistry between the leads, the striking visuals and the sweeping soundtracks have spun your head around, the adrenaline quickly fades. And what remains is little more than a vague memory. Instead of a complex, dark, morally ambiguous story about destructive passion, we are left with a simplified interpretation that focuses on physical attraction and spectacle, where the inner conflict turns into an easily recognizable gesture. and where moral ambiguity is replaced by the much more familiar language of desire. And that's all for today. Thanks to everyone who watched this video and supported it. Give me thumbs up, I really appreciate it. See you next time. Bye.